afternoon, and thank you for being here today. We are gathered on the traditional territory of Treaty 6, and I also want to acknowledge the Métis people who share a deep connection with this land. Just earlier today, Jason Nixon made the claim that his government is making historical investments in housing, more than in any other province. Today's announcement from Minister Nixon is one-time funding that will disappear once select affordable housing providers try to catch up on costs. And then they will be right back to square one once that money runs out. There are over 3,000 people experiencing houselessness in Edmonton, double what it was 5 years ago, and many on the front lines will say it's actually probably far higher than that. The homeless population in Lethbridge has doubled under the UCP's watch, and in Calgary alone, 115,000 people are at high risk of homelessness because they can't afford their current housing. These Albertans, among many others, aren't seeing any results from the UCP to address this housing crisis like the minister claims. And especially on a day like today, where we are seeing temperatures of -50 with the wind chill, I want to say a heartfelt thank you to the frontline workers, housing providers, and shelter workers who are working every day to keep people warm and safe throughout a very challenging time. Now, while the UCP like to make claims with cherry-picked data and decade-long forecasted budgets that aren't keeping pace with actual results, the reality for many Albertans once again contradicts the UCP. So let's look at that reality. Compared to this time last year, housing starts in the province are down 9%. And we know that with the amount of people moving to Alberta, that migration and immigration were outpacing housing at an alarming rate. To keep up with population growth, the province would need to be building 70,000 units annually just to keep up. And this is more than double the UCP's own targets, which they are in fact on track to miss by 4,000 units. And while the UCP like to claim that they're working in partnership with municipalities to address the problem, Albertans' reality is vastly different. Alberta only received 2.5% of the federal dollars for provinces through the Rapid Housing Initiative. While both major cities expressed their disappointment in the UCP's inability to negotiate funding for the 39 proposed projects for this initiative, Calgary took the opportunity to unlock $228 million in federal funding to build 6,800 homes through the Home is Here plan, which included critical bylaw and zoning renewals. The UCP's reaction to this, though, it was to scold the city and demand municipalities work with the province, despite the UCP's inability to effectively negotiate dollars for Albertans. And let's talk about purpose-built rentals. The minister has claimed that these are up in Alberta more than anywhere in Canada, but in October, we saw purpose-built rentals increasing slightly in Calgary only. As well, condo and homeowner-built housing were down in Calgary, and all types of build, including purpose-built rentals, were down here in Edmonton. And currently, as we know, and as I've talked about a lot, Edmonton is experiencing the steepest rent increases across Canada, with Calgary now in number 2. So clearly the need exists here as well. And what's even more concerning is that overall builds in year-to-date growth charts are decreasing in Calgary and Edmonton, and rural areas and other areas across the province. So we could sit here all day addressing the numbers, but what this boils down to is that here in Alberta, we are absolutely in a housing crisis. There are more than double the amount of people experiencing homelessness on the streets of Edmonton and Lethbridge than there were 5 years ago. More than half of Albertans are worried about keeping up with their mortgage or their rent. Students are reported to be living in their cars because they cannot find housing. Families are skipping meals to pay for housing. Seniors, we've heard from seniors who we know are on fixed incomes, experiencing rent increases of 20, 30, even 50%. Those living on disability supplements and AISH are being priced out of their homes. On Monday, Edmonton is set to declare housing and homelessness an emergency here in our city. The UCP are clearly failing Albertans on this front. Danielle Smith, Jason Nixon, and their government have been ignoring their responsibility in the housing crisis. And we know that mats on the floor aren't a solution. Tents on the street aren't a solution. Fighting with Ottawa is certainly not the solution. I've repeatedly asked Minister Nixon to join me, to work together to address the crisis around us. And on Monday, Edmonton City Council will be doing just that. They will be discussing this crisis. But Minister Nixon has just said just a few moments ago that he's refusing to be a part of that discussion on the housing crisis. I invite him to join me at that meeting, to be part of the solution instead of shifting the blame. So with that, thank you for being here, and I'm happy to take your questions today.
We'll now open up to questions. For those joining by Zoom, it's the *9 or the raise hand function. We'll start with questions in the room.
Thank you. I'm hoping to get a response from Minister Nixon today in his announcement this morning in response to questions about, so he plans to declare a homelessness emergency. He did say that our shelters have standards. You have to meet those standards in order to receive funding from the provincial government, adding that anyone who would imply that Alberta shelters are somehow less safe than the images we are seeing in encampments right now and police have put out, I think needs to give their head a shake. What is your response to that statement and the minister saying there are standards in place in order to receive provincial funding for those spaces?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Thank you. I had the opportunity to, over the last 2 weeks to visit every encampment sweep. As I've said many times, each of those encampments were in my riding of Edmonton, Highlands, Norwood. And those folks living in those tents, they're my constituents, right? Even if they don't have a roof over their head, a proper roof over their head, they're my constituents. And I needed them to know that they matter and that we're here for them as well. And I can share with Minister Nixon just some of the heartbreaking stories I've heard from folks. I've asked so many of them, why do you choose not to go to shelters? And they'll tell you they don't feel safe. They'll tell you that they will be separated from their loved ones, from their partner, from their belongings. They'll tell you about their own history with intergenerational trauma. Perhaps the residential school survivors or family members of residential school survivors. The list goes on. There are so many reasons why people choose not to stay in shelters. And I'm not saying tents are more safe, especially not when it's -50, but there need to be standards in place. The City of Edmonton developed comprehensive minimum shelter standard guidelines in 2021. I've asked, previous people in my role have asked about those shelter standards and why the province isn't implementing them, and we're not getting an answer.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, I guess what would you like to see in terms of those minimum safety standards? What questions do you have in terms of how they're being upheld? You said mats on the floor isn't enough. What would be?
Exactly. So the shelter standards the city developed have a number of requirements in them. One of the key ones is around 24/7 access, especially right now. I again, shout out to the shelter workers, frontline workers right now and the providers who've opened up their spaces 24/7, but that's not the situation year round. And so many will tell you, like, it's not helpful when you're kicked out of a shelter when that might be the only safe place that you can be. And so my question for Minister Nixon has been and will continue to be, what is the latest on those shelter standards? Are you willing to work with the City of Edmonton to fully implement them? And my worry, given his response this morning saying he's unwilling to even meet with Mayor Sohi and the city, my worry is that he's got no interest in implementing those minimum shelter standards.
Hi, Morgan with Global News. Beyond shelter standards, I want to talk about shelter capacity. We've heard from the province and the city that there are enough spaces. Social agencies and some people experiencing houselessness say they're not finding that to be the case.
Absolutely.
What kind of data changes or better reporting needs to happen to make that, that both they understand the same point, that it's coming together? So
first of all, again, this has been a struggle for the last while trying to get any sort of clarity on the number. So even if there were 1,700 fully operational safe, accessible shelter spaces, we know that there are at least 3,000 folks who are experiencing houselessness. And again, walk with me on the streets, you'll find that that number is probably far higher. And so I can't give you answers around the capacity because we've not been given that clarity. The data available publicly on the province's open data website hasn't been updated since November 30th. So when Minister Nixon says that data is publicly available, where is it? We're not seeing it. I am hopeful. His message this morning was that they are going to be moving forward.
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention,
There may be an alarm.
There has been an emergency reported in the building.
Okay.
Please evacuate the building by the...
All right, so there has been an emergency declared in the meeting, so we are going to end this press conference. But thank you for being here, and we appreciate your time.